West India Company Director Willem Kieft had made an incredible mess of the new Netherland Colony in North America. He'd been picking fights with its residents, started the disastrous Kieft-Indian War, plunged the colony into poverty, and caused the depopulation of New Netherland. When the West India Company directors received letters from the New Netherlanders complaining about the directors' mismanagement of the colony, they decided to appoint another, more capable ruler, someone with diplomatic and military skills. On May 11, 1647, this new director arrived at Manhattan to replace Kieft as the Redresser General, to sort out all colonial malpractices. But who was this peg-legged man? I am Yvette. This is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 4 of the story of New Amsterdam, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. To support the channel, like, comment, subscribe, and share. You can find links to my sources, the music, and other ways to support the channel in the description below. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. Peterstuyvesant was born around 1612 in Peperga in Friesland to Balthasar Johannes Stuyvesant and Margaretha Hardenstein. Little Peter moved to Scherpenzeel when his father became the reverend of the town's Frisian Reformed Church. After Peter's mother died, his father remarried in 1627. The young man left Scherpenzeel to attend the Latin school in Leeuwarden and went on to study at the University of Franeker. While most figured he'd become a reverend, like his dad, he signed up for language and philosophy, not theology. Over the years, many American historians assumed Peter was some kind of proto-American free spirit, but the man was Frisian. Stubbornness, often mistaken for independence, was baked in. By the way, Americans also anglicized his name to Peter, but the name Peter was never used in the Dutch Republic during the 17th century. However, while at the university, Peter Latinized his name to Petrus. 2 years into his studies, Petrus dropped out. It appeared he was kicked out for bad behavior, including vandalism, unruliness, and perhaps even theft. Troublesome students were often shipped off to faraway lands, but in this case it seems like the Stuyvesant family took a hard look at the young man's future possibilities. It appeared that Papa Stuyvesant wasn't making any headway in his career and lacked powerful connections for his son to get a head start as a reverend. Dad wanted Peter to choose a more profitable career to ensure the family's upward mobility. During the Republic's colonial era, careers with the most upward mobility were available in the trading companies. Though the reason why isn't entirely clear, Peter ended up at the West India Company as a lowly assistant, and his papa happily waved him off. The hard-working Stuyvesant, who made friends and enemies along the way, was rewarded, if we can call it that, with a post on the remote island of Fernando de Noronha, 200 miles of the Brazilian coast, a literal rat's nest. He was soon promoted to a position in the coastal colony of Pernambuco in Dutch Brazil, and finally ended up in Curaçao as a supplies officer. In 1642, Stuyvesant caught a major break when his enemy, Commander Jan Claeszoon van Kampen, died. While lacking any military training, Stuyvesant got his job as commander of Dutch political and military operations in the Caribbean. The new governor worked to bring order in the chaos of the swamp. His was a central hub, and his powers extended to New Netherland. For instance, when Stuyvesant got word of Director Kieft's troubles there, he promised to send help. Among other things, Stuyvesant led a successful attack on a Spanish outpost on the Venezuelan coast. Then the governor planned to retake Sint Maarten. In 1631, the Dutch had built their first building, a fort, in the Caribbean on Sint Maarten, a little island that the Dutch called the hook or corner of the Antilles chain. 2 years later, the Spanish seized the strategically located fort. The West India Company wanted it back on account of the salt trade, to unload ships there with salt or other ballast, because the salt pan of the island of Sint Maarten is more accessible than any other in this region. By the 1640s, the Spanish Empire was stretched to the limit, waging the 80 Years' War against the Dutch rebels, assisting the Holy Roman Emperor in his 30 Years' War, and all kinds of battles the world over against, well, everyone, but mostly the Dutch. With the empire crumbling, its Caribbean and South American holdings were in play. The company ordered Governor Peterstuyvesant to attack Sint Maarten. On January 14, 1644, Stuyvesant arrived at Key Bay with 800 soldiers. His spies had told him that the Spanish military complement on the island was small. The governor's men landed on the beach, dug in, and set up a siege cannon. Then the big guns from the fort unleashed. So the spies had been wrong. The Spanish had recently re-garrisoned and resupplied the fort. Stuyvesant, eager to prove himself, ordered return fire. He enthusiastically picked up a Dutch flag and jumped onto the earthen rampart of the fort, and walked straight into the range of the Spanish guns. Just as he planted the flag, the Spanish cannons fired again. Stuyvesant went down. A stone ball had shattered his right leg. Before losing consciousness, he ordered the siege to continue. The attack ultimately failed, though the Spanish gave up their rights soon after. The governor wrote the company board that the attack on the island did not succeed so well as I had hoped, no small impediment having been the loss of my right leg, it being removed by a rough ball. Stuyvesant had to have his leg amputated. Dutch doctors had become quite experienced in the limb removal business on account of the many injuries they treated during the 80 Years' War, but each technique was more horrifying than the next. Luckily, the 34-year-old Peter survived the heinous procedure and continued to manage the company's affairs in the Caribbean. He monitored the salt pans, strategized to keep lurking English, French, Spanish, and pirate vessels away from Dutch holdings, and figured out how to send freshly baked bread to ships out on maneuvers. He even dealt with some 450 Dutch refugee soldiers who'd narrowly escaped a Spanish attack on their outpost in Brazil. Since food rations were desperately low, Stuyvesant couldn't afford to feed them, so he ordered them to New Amsterdam and helped Director Kieft with his Indian troubles, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. As you may remember, Kieft never used them. Stuyvesant's stump simply wouldn't heal in the tropical climate. Despite his protests, he was sent to the Republic on the Milkmaid in August 1644 to recuperate. After an excruciating journey, he arrived in the Republic in December, where he was taken to his sister's Anneke's house near Leiden and fell in love with the live-in nurse. Judith Bayard was the 37-year-old sister of Anneke's husband, Nicolaas Bayard. She moved in after her minister father died in Breda and was put in charge of the patient. No one believed Stuyvesant was brave enough to court her, but he took the naysayers up on their wager that he'd flounder and married her less than a year later. Once the wound was healed, Peterstuyvesant resolutely hobbled into company headquarters in Amsterdam, sporting a new wooden leg. He told the company he was fit for duty and ready to return to Curaçao. But the company had other plans for him. The West India Company directors held a colonist petition demanding Director Willem Kieft's removal in one hand and Governor Peterstuyvesant's request to return to duty in the other, and thought, perfect. The company directors didn't care about the colonists' request for a representative government, that was just a silly notion, but they agreed the blundering Kieft had to go. Still, they understood from the rebel colonists' letter that this North American outpost differed from the Dutch colonies in Brazil, the Spice Islands, and everywhere else. Sure, the other places had their fair share of problems, the Amborna massacre anyone, but these outposts were ruled by military might. New Netherland hadn't been ruled by military might, like, ever? It was high time the New Netherlanders got a Baas, a boss. Since Kieft had launched the war but never set foot outside the fort to lead any charge, they needed to look for a true leader, a skilled administrator and diplomat, a man with military experience, someone who'd lead the charge in battle, who wasn't afraid to get hurt, who understood duty and station, and could keep the colonists in check. It was a tall order. But in hobbled Peterstuyvesant, who, despite the peg leg, or maybe because of it, was 10 times the man any director of New Netherland had ever been. However, he also remained in charge of all the Dutch Caribbean islands, Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, Saba, Sint Eustatius, and Sint Maarten. So he wasn't just a director, like his predecessors, he was a Director General. Despite all the confusion on the internet and in books, the New Netherland Colony didn't have a governor, nor a Governor General title, so the Governor Stuyvesant thing refers to his title in the Caribbean. But Stuyvesant asked everyone to address him as Lord General. It took 2 years for his commission to be made official, because of internal disagreements about if and how New Netherlands should be reformed, and then the States General took its sweet time to approve the decision. Peterstuyvesant had a colossal task ahead of him. None of his predecessors had come out of their commission unscathed. On Christmas Day 1646, Stuyvesant de Prinsesse Amalia set sail from Texel with 3 other ships. But the Director General wanted to swing by Curaçao first. A bit of a detour, a long detour. His pregnant wife and his sister were with him, as well as soldiers, traders, adventurers, and a new reverend, Johannes Corneliszoon Bakkerus. His own council also came with him. They begged him to reconsider the long detour, but he wouldn't budge. At St. Christopher's, the fleet encountered the Liefde, the love. Stuyvesant discovered the papers weren't in order and he confiscated the vessel. He stayed in Curaçao for 3 weeks as Princess Amalia's hull was neatly packed with 200,000 pounds of red dyewood. All the while, Stuyvesant was treating his council like dirt. He was the boss. Everyone had to obey. Period. No questions asked. If anyone had a problem with that, they could take it up with the management. Him. Yeah, New Netherland had a thing coming their way. Peterstuyvesant was a chess grandmaster compared to ex-director Willem Kief's checkers without a board. Once he and his wife were settled in at Fort Amsterdam, the Director General moved fast to tackle all the problems in the colony, ranking all threats according to priority and handling them methodically. His main job was to hold the line against English invaders of company territory and to do everything in his power to keep peace with the Indians and to restore friendly relations with them. He also had to implement government reform, for which the States General gave him very precise instructions. A company director was no longer the only one in charge of civil and military affairs. His administration would now include 2 prominent officers, a vice-director, Lubbert van Dinklage, and a schout-fiscaal, ensign Hendrik Thomassen van Dijk. Added to the Director General's council were Captain Brian Newton, an Englishman who had loyally served under Stuyvesant at Curaçao, Adriaan Keizer, the commissary, and Jesmer Thomas, a Dutch Navy captain. Stuyvesant added Kief's first councillor, Dr. Johannes La Montagne. The Lord General also kept on Cornelis van Tienhoven as the company's secretary. Sure, the man was greedy, dishonest, and sexually deviant, but he was smart, loyal to the company, led military assaults, and could speak the language of the natives. George Baxter, Kief's English secretary, also kept his job, since he was the only man at Manhattan who could tolerably read or write the English language. Paulus Leendertsen van der Grist was made equipage master, the man in charge of building, repairing, supplying, and sending out ships. Next, Stuyvesant did away with the Thursday council sessions. The sweat of thy brow Calvinists believed getting a colony in line was a 24/7 job, so meetings every day. Stuyvesant then created a court of justice. He appointed Van Dinklage its chief judge, but the Director General reserved presiding rights. After a drunken knife fight on Stuyvesant's first Sunday afternoon at the colony, he issued proclamations against Sabbath desecration, drunkenness, and all quarreling. With nearly 1/4 of the houses in New Amsterdam licensed for the sale of brandy, tobacco, or beer, Stuyvesant's council paused the granting of new licenses. After the 9 p.m. bell, no liquor could be sold to anyone, and no alcohol was served before 2 p.m. on Sundays. And no liquors could be sold to the Indians under a penalty of 500 guilders. The seller was also held responsible for any damage caused by a drunken native. Additionally, no one was allowed to sell firearms or ammunition to the Indians under any circumstances. That rule also applied to the semi-independent state of Rensselaerswijk. Anyone who drew a knife in passion or anger faced 6 months imprisonment on bread and water. If one wounded someone with the knife, boom! 18 months. Fortunately, Stuyvesant, unlike his predecessor Kieft, treated colonists and West India Company sailors and soldiers alike before the law. Speaking of the law, lawyer Adriaan van der Donck was like, hey. Jonker van der Donck had been the main driving force in the colony for demanding a representative government, but switched gears fast. If he wanted an in with the new director and change the colony from within, he'd better butter him up. He offered to pay Stuyvesant a year's supply of wheat and oats from the Rensselaerswijk farmers for his family and animals. Pegleg Pete instantly liked him. Van der Donck was competent, ambitious, and obviously West India Company official material. Well, Adriaan Two-Face van der Donck had no interest whatsoever in becoming a company man. He was in the middle of a secret plot to sue the pants off of ex-director Willem Kieft. The Indian threat was gone, the old director had been ousted, and everything went back to making money in New Amsterdam. Except there was one group of people who had no intention of letting departing director Willem Kieft off easy. The two main rebel-rousers were Joachim Pietersen-Kuyter and Cornelis Melijn, two colonists of means and education who'd lost nearly everything under Kieft's destructive rule. Director General Peterstuyvesant had promised a formal review of the former director's case. The duo, trader Govert Lokermans, Englishman Thomas Hall, Augustine Heerman from Bohemia, and several other New Amsterdam residents wanted to ensure the trial went badly for the man, and drag others responsible down with him. In deepest secret, Adriaan van der Donck helped the men curate a list of legal questions that they believed Stuyvesant should ask Kieft and the men involved in Kieft's war. Among the men to be questioned under oath were Ensign Hendrik Thomassen van Dijk, who'd led attacks on the Indians, and Cornelis van Tienhoven, Kieft's secretary and enforcer, who'd suggested taxing local tribes in exchange for the company's protection. Oh boy. These men had no clue whatsoever the type of man their new director was. In mid-June 1647, Peterstuyvesant planned to persecute Willem Kieft in person, thinking it would be quick and easy. Listeners, it was neither quick nor easy. The members of Kieft's 8-man council handed him the list of questions he should use in the interrogations. Adriaan van der Donck, meanwhile, smoothly slipped in a demand that the colonists got a voice in government. Stuyvesant was stunned. What is this, even? The Director General disbanded the meeting and spent the night reading through all the documents. The following day, he reconvened the council, his own council, and a few Kieft fanboys. It was all for show. He'd already made up his mind. He told his council of yes-men, "These petitioners are disturbers of the public peace. If this point be conceded, will not these cunning fellows, in order to usurp over us a more unlimited power, claim and assume in consequence even greater authority against ourselves and our commission, should it happen that our administration may not square in every respect with their whims?" If they allowed vassals to rebel and dictate the government, it set a dangerous precedent. Who knows what they would demand next? To rule themselves? Wait. Hadn't the Dutch rebelled against their lord, deposed him, and now ruled themselves? That's different. The colony was a military outpost where an order was an order, no debate. Stuyvesant decreed these rebels weren't even proper representatives of the colonists. That 8-man council was gone, and he refused to consider a petition from private individuals. He ended by saying, "It is treason to petition against one's magistrates, whether there be cause or not." The company council agreed with him, and the petition of the malignant subjects was rejected. Kuyter and Melijn protested. The new director was just covering for the old director because they were West India Company besties. I mean, Kieft is a member of the council, come on now! Chess Grandmaster Stuyvesant had expected this protest and came prepared. He dramatically plunked the rebels' complaint letter they had sent to the West India Company in front of Kieft, a letter the ex-director never knew existed. Wait, the company board hadn't asked for his recall? The colonists had? What the flying frack? Willem Kieft furiously wrote a formal complaint, exactly as Chess Grandmaster Stuyvesant had predicted. In it, Kieft declared that these men had plotted with false and bitter poison to calumniate their magistrates and to bring them into difficulty, complaining that they had dispatched in an irregular manner and clandestinely sent off that libelous letter. He demanded that Melijn and Kuyter be sent to Amsterdam to be prosecuted there as pests and seditious persons and clear his name. Stuyvesant was like, "Thank you." He had all he needed to make his next move against the treasonous subjects. "These brutes may hereafter try to knock me down also, but I will manage it so now that they will have their bellies full for the future." He sent a messenger with a copy of Kieft's letter to Maarten and Kuyter. Respond within 48 hours, please. Team Treason could have backed down and thrown themselves at the mercy of the new Director General. But they didn't. Team Treason reassembled in secret, and judging from the language, Adriaan van den Donk wrote their response, rebutting all Kieft's charges point by point. Their council was legit and had protested the war against the Indians according to the rules. They also provided damning evidence against Kieft's claim that the council had approved of his plan to tax the Indians. The council members hadn't libeled Kieft in their letters to the directors in Amsterdam. Behold the piles of ashes around New Netherland. What more evidence do you need? The men accused Kieft of taking on princely powers and welcomed a trial in Old Amsterdam. Let us then see what the nation of laws thinks of it. Stuyvesant countered with a long legal analysis. Disregard the peace talks for a moment. The Dutch Republic was at war with Spain. New Netherland was an outpost of that war, and according to the Articles of War, to utter words tending to mutiny and rebellion demands capital punishment. So he'd make an example out of them. He charged the council with instigating the Indian War, counseling to give up Manhattan to the English, and threatening Kieft with personal violence. With the Director General and his council acting as both prosecutors and judges, he ruled that Cornelis Maarten, leader of Team Treason, would be put to death and his property confiscated. Joachim Kuyter should be banished and his property confiscated. But the majority of Stuyvesant's council were like, "Oh, hold your horses, sir." Stuyvesant grumbled, "Fine. Maarten is banished for 7 years, fined 300 guilders, and is forfeited all benefits derived from the company. Kuyter is sentenced to 3 years banishment and a fine of 150 guilders. When Maarten said he'd appealed the sentence in the Republic, Stuyvesant roared, "If I were persuaded that you would divulge our sentence or bring it before their high mightinesses, I would have you hanged at once on the highest tree in New Netherland." He later told merchant Arnoldus van Hardenberg, "If anyone during my administration shall appeal, I will make him a foot shorter and send the pieces to Holland and let him appeal in that way." The sentences didn't go over well with anyone, and the council, reading the room, forced the Director General to simply execute the ban. Stuyvesant ordered Team Treason to leave on the first available ship, giving Maarten and Kuyter a chance to appeal the ruling in the Republic. On August 16, 1647, the duo left for the Republic on the Prinsesse Amalia. They were joined by Willem Kieft, Reverend Everardus Bogardus, and the refugee soldiers from Brazil that Stuyvesant could finally offload. New Amsterdam was an inch away from falling into ruin. Its fort's defenses were crumbling, with cattle trotting all over the walls and had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The church was unfinished. They needed an embankment to protect the waterfront from the tide. The mostly unnamed streets, or rather paths, were either muddy or dusty depending on the weather, and were increasingly narrow because the wooden thatched houses were built ever closer to it. Plus, these houses were a fire hazard. Pig pens and outhouses were built directly on the street, causing a stink, and hogs ran all over the place. Stuyvesant told his board they needed a school, church, sheet piling, a pier, and similar highly necessary public works and common buildings. This, our capital, needed to be made strong if it was to survive against the threats from everywhere. And the Lord General wanted it done yesterday. Stuyvesant issued a slew of other orders to create a better capital. Owners of vacant lots had to fence everything in and develop the area within 9 months. The cattle and swine had to be kept in fenced-in pastures away from the streets. The Director General appointed Van Dinklage, Van Tienhoven and Van de Grist as surveyors to regulate the location and structure of new houses. He appointed fire wardens to inspect the buildings. Owners were fined if their chimneys were dirty or if their houses burned through their negligence. Meanwhile, the government provided funds for fire ladders, hooks and buckets. A pier was built on the East River shore where all vessels were forced to anchor for proper supervision. Director Stuyvesant, a devout member of the Reformed Church, sat on the church board and ordered the building to be finished. From now on, there would be services twice a day, every day. Reverend Johannes Bakkerus, who had arrived with the director, took over from Reverend Bogardus. This all sounded like a great plan. but the director needed money for all these works. First, he checked the accounting books of the colony. So, people were privately selling furs to Virginia and New England. He decreed an end to the defrauding of the West India Company. So, many of the Indians employed as servants or day laborers were often defrauded of their wages. He decreed anyone who didn't pay their debts would be punished with a large fine. Well, that was a little, but he needed more. He sent off 2 vessels, the Kat and the Liefde, to bring home Spanish prizes. Still not enough. Hello, taxes. Director General Peterstuyvesant introduced an import and export tax and a tax on wines and beers in New Netherland. Yes, these taxes would fill the treasury in record time, but the people were outraged. They protested. Unless the people had a say in colonial matters, the company should pay its own expenses. This was arguably the first New World appeal of no taxation without representation. Stuyvesant tried to convince them it was for the good of all, but the colonists weren't buying it. Since the director needed money more badly than he needed absolute power, he conceded. Fine. In exchange for taxes, 9 representatives from New Amsterdam could give advice when the director asked, but they couldn't legislate, just like in the old country. These gemeensmannen could also hear civil cases, and plaintiffs had the right to appeal his court's verdicts to this 9-man council. Some representation for taxation. The gemeensmannen were picked according to the method of the Republic cities. The residents selected 18 of the most notable, reasonable, honest, and respectable persons. And from this group, Stuyvesant chose a single number of 9 to serve on his Privy Council. In September 1647, this board of 9 men was established until lawfully repealed. The director was its president, who could call or disband it at his discretion. And to ensure the 9 men didn't get too powerful or problematic, 6 members were rotated out every year and replaced from a list of 12 of the most notable citizens selected by the commonalty. The first board had men from 3 categories. 3 merchants, Arnoldus van Hardenberg, Govert Lokermans and Augustine Heerman. 3 residents, Jan Jansen Dam, Jacob Wolfertsen van Kouwenhoven and Hendrik Kip. And 3 farmers, Machiel Jansen, Jan Evertsen Bout and English tobacco farmer Thomas Hall. These 9 men approved taxes for all the projects, but refused to fund the repairs for the fort. The 1629 West India Company's charter clearly stated that the company bore all military expenses. The director should pay for those with the port and mill duties. Adriaan van der Donck wasn't in the first batch of 18 picked by the residents, but if he wanted political change in New Netherland, he had to be on that board. So he went to work to get himself elected. With most of the colony matters sorted out, it was time to tackle the issues outside New Netherland, or rather, still inside on its outer edges, where New Englanders and New Swedes had set up shop. The Swedes posed no direct threat yet, but the English kept moving closer and closer. Director General Stuyvesant lacked means or men to stop their invasion. He'd give diplomacy a whirl. The most influential man in New England was Massachusetts Bay elderly Governor John Winthrop, who was 20 years into building his Puritan paradise, the city upon a hill. Stuyvesant asked Governor Winthrop to discuss borders. Winthrop was like, sure, but we're kind of busy right now. Talk later. Toodaloo. Stuyvesant was like, you wanna play? Let's play. In follow-up letters, he politely reminded the New England governors of the overwhelming might of the Dutch Navy. Of course, he failed to mention that he had no access to this navy. Stuyvesant still went ahead to prove his point. A trading vessel, the Santo Benigno, owned by an Italian businessman based in Amsterdam, entered the harbor of New Haven, a colony of English settlers in Dutch territory. The Santo Benigno had been trading for a month but had no license from the West India Company. Stuyvesant was like, nasty smuggles are smugglers. The West India Company had just sold a Dutch ship, De Zwol, to the deputy governor of New Haven, Theophilus Eaton. Stuyvesant sent over De Zwol, stuffed Trojan Horse style, or more accurately, Surprise of Breda style, with soldiers. Captain Paulus van der Gris pulled up alongside the Santo Benigno in the New Haven harbor. The soldiers emerged, jumped aboard, and cut the ship's lines. Van der Gris left the Zwolle behind for her new owner, took command of the Santo Benigno, and piloted her out to sea to New Amsterdam before the English even knew what hit them. Stuyvesant informed authorities at New Haven that the entire region, from Cape Henlopen to Cape Cod, was part of the territory of New Netherland. He had the right to levy duties upon all Dutch vessels trading within those limits. Eaton was mad and fired off a letter to the Dutch governor as a disturber of the public peace by making unjust claims to our lands and plantations, to our havens and rivers, and by taking a ship out of our harbor without our license. Stuyvesant replied mockingly, "For what I have either written or done that may seem offensive, that ship was legally confiscated within the boundaries of New Netherland, begrepen? It was a Dutch ship, it had violated Dutch laws and what the Dutch regarded their territory by right of first discovery." He had written the letter in Dutch, so Eaton couldn't understand. Petty. Then 3 servants of the West India Company fled from Manhattan to New Haven. Stuyvesant told Eaton to surrender these deserters in New Haven, New Netherland. Eaton was like, "Excuse you? What do you mean, New Haven, New Netherland?" The governor refused to release anyone lest Stuyvesant thought he'd obey the Dutch, but harboring each other's fugitives was a dangerous practice, and Governor Winthrop was like, "Dude." Stuyvesant issued a proclamation like a boss. If any person, noble or ignoble, freeman or slave, debtor or creditor, yea, to the lowest prisoner included, run away from the colony of New Haven, or seek refuge in our limits, he shall remain free under our protection on taking the oath of allegiance. Stuyvesant quickly assured Massachusetts Bay and Virginia that this rule did not apply to them. The inhabitants of Manhattan were like, "Wait, hold up, we don't want to become a refuge for English vagabonds and outlaws." Oops. The chess grandmaster fumbled, but recovered quickly. Stuyvesant bribed the runaways to escape and return home, and a few months later, he quietly revoked his proclamation with his dignity intact. The English were a pest to the New Netherlanders in more ways than one. In September 1647, Andrew Forster tramped through the Palisades into New Amsterdam. 10 years earlier, James Farrar had already told Director Kieft that Long Island belonged to Willem Alexander, the Earl of Stirling, as per the decree of King Charles I. Kieft had the man arrested and sent to the Republic, but he escaped after arrival. The Earl had recently died, and his widow, Dowager Countess of Stirling, Janet Erskine, sent over Forster on her behalf. The agent gathered the English settlers at Hampstead, on North Long Island, and waved a parchment covered in official-looking seals. He was governor of the entire island by grant from the English crown. The residents were like, "You funny. Peter, come check this guy out." When Stuyvesant arrived, Forster told him to surrender to him. Stuyvesant didn't. He arrested Forster, despite his very consequential airs. Was the man insane? Or was this some twisted English ploy that required proper diplomatic niceties? He asked his council, "What shall be done with said pretended governor?" Adriaan van der Donck, fluent in English, on account of his English wife, came to the rescue. He and 2 other English speakers interrogated the man. Stuyvesant figured to let the Dutch government officials deal with him and put him on a ship bound for the Republic. However, this ship first put in at an English port, where the agent escaped and was never heard of again. Enter Lord with Fiefdom Aspirations number 2. Sir Edmund Plowden, who'd already bothered Director Kieft, waved a document signed by the Deputy General of Ireland. He was lord of his kingdom, New Albion, an area from Long Island, aka the Isle of Plowden, and all of present-day New Jersey and parts of Delaware and Maryland. Van der Donck, handle this please. When Plowden told the lawyer his paperwork had him kicked out of New Sweden, Stuyvesant was like, "Same," and kicked him out of New Netherland. The man eventually wound up in an English debtor's prison. New England's 4 colonies were not all on the same page when it came to the Dutch. The 2 closest to New Netherland, Connecticut with its capital Hartford, and New Haven, were aggressive toward the Dutch whose land they invaded. But New Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay wanted to find a way to live with their neighbor. While the English Civil War raged, New Englanders had been forced to become more dependent on Manhattan for all their shipping needs, and it was in their best interest for the moment to keep the peace. While New England had pretty much governed itself, Director General Stuyvesant knew Old England would soon want to regain control of the colonies. It was high time for a treaty with all 4 leaders to establish borders and preserve what was left of New Netherland. So, Stuyvesant targeted New England's most influential governor, John Winthrop, and had his English secretary George Baxter translate his letter. The Dutch director made a formal proposition that the boundaries of New Netherland should be recognized as the Connecticut and Delaware rivers. Let's all meet. Baxter delivered the letter in Boston just as the 4 New England leaders were having a meeting. Winthrop showed it to them. Then all 4 wrote a joint statement. First, they welcomed Stuyvesant to America, expressed a wish for peaceful coexistence, then rambled on about the Dutch selling guns to the Indians and that the port of New Amsterdam restricted trade. But sure, we'll have a meeting. Stuyvesant was satisfied he'd have a border agreement. Soonish. Under peterstuyvesant's administration, New Netherland flourished. Immigration increased, all the Kief's war destruction was repaired, farmers returned to their farms, and trade picked up. Stuyvesant actually listened to the 9-man board and followed up on their suggestions. But the cracks were beginning to show. It started when the board gave the director a list of measures they said would improve the economy. Well, I have never, oh, wait a minute, this might work. Meanwhile, Adriaan van der Donck was doing his darndest to be recognized as an MVP of the colony and offered his help whenever he could. Harmen van den Boogaard, the barber surgeon who journeyed into Haudenosaunee country in the middle of winter to secure trade deals against the French, was now married with 4 children. He'd bought stock in a privateer's vessel called La Garce, went raiding with it, and then got a job as a supply master to the company. First in New Amsterdam, then at Fort Orange. But Van den Boogaard had a little secret. He liked men. He'd started a secret relationship with a young black servant, Tobias, until they were caught in flagrante delicto at the end of 1647. Well, in the 17th century, a man doing the dance with no pants with another man was a sin equal to murder and punishable by death, preceded by a healthy dose of torture. He was locked up at Fort Orange, but the place wasn't exactly up to date on security protocols, and Van den Boogaard escaped and fled to Mohawk country, the only place he felt he could hide. Schout-fiscaal Nicolaas Koren, Adriaan van der Donck's replacement in Rensselaerswijk, went all Sherlock Holmes on Van den Boogaard and figured out where he'd be. He sent woodsman Hans Vos to find him, arguably America's first bounty hunting expedition. Vos cornered Van den Boogaard in a Haudenosaunee longhouse filled with pelts, sewant and food stores. Cue shootout. Van den Boogaard set the place on fire as a distraction to make his getaway, but Vos caught him and locked him up in Fort Orange's prison. Vos got 8 guilders for having, in the name of the patroon at the peril of his life, pursued the fugitive outside the limits of the colony. Koren asked Stuyvesant what do we do with him? The director told him he'd preside over Van den Boogaard's trial, but since the rivers were frozen, they had to wait until spring to ship him over. A desperate Van den Boogaard wasn't going to wait for Stuyvesant's wrath and managed to escape from the fort's prison again. He didn't dare escape through the English settlements and, chased by Fort Orange guards, ran across the frozen Hudson River, fell through and drowned. He was 39 years old. The Mohawk, having picked up a few European habits or two, sued the West India Company for the loss of their grain warehouse. No, not war again. Van der Donck, who knew all about the Mohawks' Italian practices, may have stepped up to advise Stuyvesant in the delicate matter. The council ruled in favor of the Indians, sold Van den Boogaard's Manhattan property, and used it to pay the company's debt to the Indians. Van der Donck also came in handy in Stuyvesant's dealings with Rensselaerswijk. Rensselaerswijk, near Fort Orange on the North Mauritius Hudson River, had a new patroon. OG patroon Kiliaan van Rensselaer's son, Johan, a miner in the Republic. The place, an independent enclave in New Netherland, was run by the patroon's guardians. And even before Director General Stuyvesant's arrival, there'd been a kerfuffle concerning merchant Govert Lokermans. To get a handle on the illegal fur trade, the patroon's guardians ordered the construction of Fort Rensselaersstein on Beeren-eiland. They also implemented the Dutch staple right, which allowed them to demand a 5 guilder fee for every vessel that passed the fort. Also, all ships had to lower their flags in honor of the patroon. Nicolaas Koren made sure everyone did. Not everyone did. Govert Lokerman sailed with his fur-laden sloop the Goede Hoop down the Hudson. He and his crew were startled by cannon fire as they sailed past Fort Rensselaerstein. Koren shouted from the ramparts, "Strike your colors!" Lokermans asked, "For whom shall I strike?" "For the staple right of Rensselaerstein." Lokermans responded, "I strike for nobody but the Prince of Orange, or those by whom I'm employed." The sloop defiantly continued on. Koren fired 3 shots from the fort, one of which grazed Lokerman's princely flag just above his head. Nicolaas Koren was immediately summoned before the council at Manhattan. New Amsterdam's goudfiscaal Cornelis van der Huygens argued the patroon couldn't control the Hudson River, but Koren claimed the patroon had a States General given right to protect his colony. Rensselaerswijk and New Netherland were headed for a showdown, and Stuyvesant wasn't the type of man to back down from a fight. Well, neither was Rensselaerswijk's recently appointed agent and commissary Bron van Slichtenhorst, basically Stuyvesant 2.0, an independent dictator. The ongoing issues between New Amsterdam and Rensselaerswijk were so delicate they required a scalpel to handle. Well, Director Stuyvesant's only instrument in his toolbox was a hammer. Stuyvesant believed his commission from the company and the States General made him ruler of the entire colony of New Netherland, including Rensselaerswijk. The Director General sent the colony a harmless proclamation that the first Wednesday of May was to be a day of public fasting and thanksgiving throughout the colony. After storms, fires, invasions, or harsh winters, leaders in Dutch communities often set aside a formal day of thanksgiving to the Almighty for seeing the inhabitants through the ordeal. Van Slichtenhorst was like, "Nope, not here, it's not." The Director General was like, "You talking back to me? You talking back to me?" Off Stuyvesant sailed to Fort Orange with a full military escort. Adriaan van der Donck, an expert on all things Rensselaerswijk, apparently accompanied the director. Upon their arrival, Van Slichtenhorst fired a welcome salvo from the estate's cannons, as one would. Stuyvesant ordered him to stand down and obey the greater authority of the Dutch colony, but Van Slichtenhorst, backed up by the patroon's charter from the States General, wasn't about to listen to a mere company director and replied, "Your complaints are unjust. I have more reason to complain on behalf of my patroon against you." Stuyvesant needed everyone to know he was the big boss man, but New Netherland security was more important. He headed back home, enraged, but sent a company of soldiers up from Manhattan to create trouble in the neighborhood. Stuyvesant found that some Rensselaerswijk houses, including one from Van Slichtenhorst close to Fort Orange, had been built on company land. In his assessment, some houses were built too close to the ramparts, hindering its function. He ordered those houses torn down and the fort repaired with stone taken from the patroon's land. The Indians, watching it all go down, were baffled. Why was this wooden leg pulling down houses of fellow Swannikins? What did it mean? The residents in the area remained unfazed, and for now, Van Slichtenhorst had won the battle. But this war was far from over. The journey of the Princesse Amalia, her hull packed full of red dye wood and 14,000 beaver pelts, and carrying passengers Willem Kieft, Joachim Kuyter, Cornelis Melijn, Reverend Everardus Bogardus, and the company soldiers who had bounced from Brazil to Curaçao to Manhattan, had been uneventful. But, close to home, the 28-year-old Captain Jan Claassen Bol mistook the Bristol Channel, aka the False Channel, for the English Channel. He wasn't the first. On September 27, 1647, the ship ran aground off the coast near Swansea in Wales. A heavy surf pounded the Princesse Amalia to pulp. The hull breached and all its valuable cargo washed out to sea. Welsh farmers had multiple field days, scouring the beaches for valuable flotsam. Joachim Kuyter was still on the surviving section of the ship with another man, but when the man didn't respond to his questions, Joachim thought he was dead. So that was a cannon? Joachim and the cannon went under, and then clinging to some wood, he rode the waves until he washed ashore the following day at Mumbles Point, along with the cannon. This gun was placed as a memorial by the awed locals. Meanwhile, Trader 2 Cornelis Melijn floated along with some of the others until they landed on a sandbank that ran dry at low tide. The group teamed up to MacGyver a raft out of pieces of debris and made it to shore, where Melijn found Kuyter. In the end, of the 107 passengers and crew, only 21 survived the Princesse Amalia's wrecking. Kieft died. Reverend Bogardus died, and most of the West India Company soldiers were gone as well. The treason duo found a few of their papers, picked up a couple of beaver skins from the flotsam, sold them in a nearby town, and used the money to go to London along with various other survivors. Their journey to London across Civil War-ravaged England took 3 weeks, but there was no one there to help them. After the king's arrest, Dutch ambassador Albert Joachimi had returned to the Republic. No European government had yet recognized the newly installed parliamentary government. Maarten and Kuyter ended up stuck for months, but were at last able to return to the Republic in December. They immediately went to work to undo Stuyvesant's sentence and prove to the Dutch government that they were right and Director Kieft had been wrong. Meanwhile, news of the shipwreck reached New Amsterdam. Many were shocked and tried to decipher its meaning. Had the God Almighty allowed Maarten and Kuyter to survive because they were innocent, and Kieft to die because he was evil? The West India Company board members mourned the loss of the Princesse Amalia and its rich cargo. Oh yeah, the loss of the people, including the soldiers as well, of course. But why did these two traitors survive, who now cause even more trouble for the company with their stupid complaints? The duo cleverly claimed that Kieft, as he was about to go under, admitted he'd been wrong about everything and begged for their forgiveness. It's not like this deathbed confession would sway a judge, but things had changed back in the home country. With the war nearly over, the West India Company, as part of the war machine, no longer held a lot of power. The rebels discovered that they had justice on their side. It took a few months, but they won a mandamus, a direct order from the States General to the Director General of the Colony of New Netherland. But first, peace. On March 14, 1647, the commander-in-chief of the Republic's armies and navies, stadholder of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland, Overijssel, Groningen en Drenthe, Lord, Marquis, Count, Baron and Burgrave of a great many places, conqueror of towns, Prince Frederik Hendrik of Orange died after an illness, aged 63. He'd been against peace his entire life, but he dropped his resistance a few months earlier. However, his heir hadn't. The 21-year-old Willem II, who, along with all the titles, had inherited the stadholderates and the Republic's military command, was anti-peace. His career and the future of the House of Orange-Nassau depended on the war continuing. France, still working its way through conquering the Spanish Netherlands and perhaps beyond, wasn't interested in peace with Spain either. So, when the French officials discovered Willem was on their side, they latched on to the impulsive, aggressive young man and persuaded him to resist the peace movement with all his might. Well, he tried, but failed. While Adriaan Pauw, the main representative of the rebel alliance during the peace negotiations with Spain and Münster, had a few stiff demands, the Spanish government had no more cards to play. Incidentally, Adriaan Pauw was the brother of the patroon of Pavonia, Michiel Pauw. Pauw, using the hard-fought 12-year truce treaty of 1609, told Spain to acknowledge the independence of the Republic of the Seven United States. The talks were headed for another 12 or 20-year truce, but France refused to commit to support the rebels after a truce ended, and the Republic, though mainly its merchants, was more determined than ever. Eternal peace or bust. The moment the Spanish offered a separate peace, most states agreed to ignore their defense treaty once made with the French and concluded peace, at last. On January 30th, 1648, the peace treaty between the Dutch rebels and the Lord of the Netherlands, the King of Spain, containing 79 points, was signed at Münster. Among many other concessions, King Felipe IV de España no longer considered the inhabitants of the Republic rebellious subjects. Spain officially recognized the Republic as a sovereign country. All the Republic's territories were determined, and the Lord, nor his descendants, would ever claim the lands again. The treaty was signed, but not all 7 states were ready to ratify it. Many in the Republic worried about angering never-peace France and their stadtholder, the Prince of Orange. Still, should they continue the war after all of Spain's concessions, just to please an unreliable and unreasonable France and its lapdog Willem? When the vote came down 5-2, Zeeland and Utrecht held out, the states of Holland argued they should ratify the treaty by a majority vote instead of unanimously as had been determined in the Union of Utrecht. Well, it would just have to do. On May 15, 1648, the treaty was ratified in the Great Hall of the Town Hall at Münster in front of a large crowd. Then, after Utrecht and at last Zeeland gave in, the proclamation of peace was announced in the Republic on June 5, 1648. The Treaty of Münster ended the Dutch Rebellion, Civil War, War of Independence. The Treaty of Osnabrück, ending the 30 Years' War, took a little longer to conclude, but was official on October 24, 1648, altering imperial power forever. There was a lot of rejoicing and praising God in the Netherlands, though some reverends, fearing the return of the Roman Catholics, continued preaching about the benefits of war and the horrors of peace. Well, it wasn't all peace yet. The Dutch were still fighting the Portuguese in the East and West Indies, the French were still fighting Spain, moving France's border ever closer to the Republic, and England was headed for a meltdown. And there were more wars around the corner. Because, of course. News of the peace slowly echoed across the world's oceans to all the outposts of the East and West India companies. They were trading hubs, but also military bases that launched raids on Spanish ships. Well, that era was gone. A new era, one filled with new political ideas, began. On December 31st, 1648, the New Amsterdam residents chose the first replacements to the board of 9 men. Adriaan van der Donck had done it. He'd worked his way into the hearts and minds of the residents and was elected to join the pool of potential representatives. Director General Stuyvesant, who thought the lawyer had company official potential, selected him for the council. He shouldn't have done that. He really shouldn't have done that. Its members promptly named van der Donck their leader and granted him the title President of the Commonalty. Early January 1649, the Board of 9, representing the residents of the villages of Newamsterdam, Breukelen, Brooklyn, New Amersfoort, Flatlands, and Pavonia, Jersey City, New Jersey, sent a joint letter to Director General peterstuyvesant. From now on, they would operate independently from Stuyvesant's personal council, which represented the company. They planned to send some representatives to the old country and asked the Dutch government to take over management of the colony. Stuyvesant could see van der Donck's fingerprints all over it. The Lord General, in the middle of preparing the peace celebrations, fumed that he would talk to the residents of several English villages in the Dutch colony first. Then he ditched the matter. The 9 men picked it right back up and started having informal meetings at the city tavern, where they talked with everyone and their mother about the future of the colony. Some even wondered out loud, was a commercial company with its dictatorial ruler even of this age anymore? The businessmen of the greatest trading power in the world uttered a few new ideas. While beaver furs were important, only tobacco, equally important, had a future. While American history books always say Manhattan succeeded as a commercial center only after the English takeover, that completely ignores the 1640s when New Amsterdam was a massive shipping hub that the English tobacco farmers in Virginia depended on. They'd become so dependent on the new Netherland port that when Old England wanted to block its colonies from using foreign shippers, Virginia successfully protested that Manhattan was vital to that colony's economic survival. In Old Amsterdam, which had subsequently become the tobacco capital of Europe, savvy traders introduced concepts of buying in bulk, premium packaging, advertising, mixing blends, and adding flavors such as lavender and nutmeg to attract a varied customer base. This tobacco thing had potential. In January 1649, Cornelis Melijn returned to New Amsterdam with a mandamus in hand and a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Melijn met with Adriaan van der Donck, Jacob van Couwenhoven, Jan Evertsen Bout, and other rebel board members at a secure location. He whipped out the officially sealed, richly calligraphed, and abundantly ribboned document from the homeland. It denounced the war that Director Kieft illegally and contrary to all public law had commenced against the Indians, and the atrocities which must startle the Christian heart that hears of them. But wait, there's more. The mandamus made the democratically elected council that Kieft and Stuyvesant half-heartedly assembled when they felt like it, official and permanent, to prevent any disasters in the future. Stuyvesant's sentences against Cornelis Melijn and Joachim Kuyter were revoked, pending appeal, and Stuyvesant himself, or a representative, had to return to the home country to explain his conduct. But wait, there's even more. Willem, the Prince of Orange, Stadtholder and Captain General of the Army and Admiral General of the Navy, had weighed in as well and had added a personal letter. To peterstuyvesant, Director of New Netherland, the 19th of May, 1648. Honorable, prudent, and discreet, specially dear, you will receive by the bearers hereof, Joachim Pietersen Kuyter and Cornelis Melijn, the commands which the High and Mighty Lord States General have resolved to communicate to you, to the end that you allow these people to enjoy their property free and unmolested there. We are disposed earnestly to admonish you hereby, in addition, expressly notifying that you shall have to allow said petitioners peaceably and without objection to enjoy the effect of their high mightinesses aforesaid resolution. And herewith, Honorable, etc., Willem, Prince d'Orange. Oh, snap. Yep, the times they were a-changing. The States General had given Melijn the task to take their mandamus to New Amsterdam and serve it on the Director General in person. But Melijn decided to wait serving it, until he found the most embarrassing moment for Stuyvesant. But the 9 men immediately told the Director General to send delegates to the Republic to demand from the West India Company and the States General that they right all the wrongs, to implement administrative reform, and to grant them a more popular government. Stuyvesant became enraged, apparently his perpetual state now. How do I know this is the will of all the people? We talk to them. Well, I forbid you to meet the people in public. Fine, we'll talk to them in private. The board members went door to door to ask the residents to support all the changes and wrote down their opinions about Darth Stuyvesant. Adriaan van der Donck spent many an hour compiling all the complaints into a single file, which he would take with him to the Republic. Stuyvesant watched them marching door to door, fuming. Rabble-rousing rebels! Mutiny! The Director General told van der Donck, "We need to talk." The records of the meeting don't exist, but the general burned with rage. Stuyvesant claimed he was holding the colony together, schmoozing with the Indians and the English, and would soon handle the Swedes down south. The lawyer should just back off and let him do his job. Then Two-Faced van der Donck finally showed his hand. He told the director the colony was rotten from the core. Without reform, the place would collapse. Stuyvesant was like, "Then we should work together. What do you say, buddy, bud? Why don't you just hand me the complaints? I'll see what I can do." Nope. The board demanded total independence from the West India Company. They would not communicate with him or follow his directions in anything pertaining to the matter. According to van der Donck, the meeting ended, with Stuyvesant expressing a bitter and unconquerable hatred for the members of the board, but principally against those whom he's supposed to be the chief authors of the move to undermine him. The gloves, insofar as they'd ever been on, came off. In Old England, after an unprecedented trial came an even more unprecedented verdict. The High Court found King Charles I guilty of attempting to uphold in himself an unlimited and tyrannical power to rule according to his will and to overthrow the rights and liberties of the people. Off with his head! Could they just do that? Well, the English felt that since the Lord Almighty hadn't struck them down with a good dose of his eternal wrath during the trial, it meant God was okay with it. For those in the Netherlands, regicide went too far. Dutch Calvinists backed the Presbyterians, who ended up siding with the Royalists. The States General made a final attempt to save the king's life and sent envoys to address Parliament, but no one listened. In January 1649, the king was beheaded in front of his own banqueting hall, and the chop echoed around the world. Without a head of state, England was now technically a republic. The States General remained neutral even after the beheading, but did name the king's heir, Charles II, king of something. But they worried about angering the English, who could do massive damage to their trade. And, well, there were the colonies. They were not wrong to be worried. The New England Puritans, quite pleased with the removal of the oppressive king, started praying for war between Old England and the Republic, so they could swoop in and seize New Netherland uncontested. The West India Company was like, uh-oh. They told Director General Peterstuyvesant to live with his neighbors on the best terms possible. Well, Stuyvesant was a little busy right now. In March 1649, Director General Stuyvesant stomped out of the fort, likely with a bunch of West India Company soldiers, and made a beeline for the home of Michiel Janssen. He and Adriaan van der Donck had been friends since his Renselaarswijk days, and whenever the lawyer was in town, he stayed over at Janssen's place. No one was home, but the director's men ransacked the place, looking for evidence. Bingo! Papers listing the residents' beef with the colony and its management, and a draft petition. Stuyvesant confiscated it all and read everything. The following day, the Director General had van der Donck arrested and imprisoned. He then assembled his 8 councillors and 6 carefully selected board of 9 members for an emergency Supreme Council. 6 against 8 plus himself ensured his desired outcome. Stuyvesant told them that van der Donck had been arrested and charged with Crimen, Laesae, Majestatis, high treason. Lese Majesty was punishable by death. The papers they found grossly slandered the Director General and contained great calumnies against the government leaders in The Hague. Stuyvesant's vice-director Lubbert van Dinklage spoke up. The general gist of these complaints is not wrong now, is it? The Honourable Lord General had indeed done many things on his own, without telling or consulting the council. Case in point, Van der Donck's arrest. Just release Van der Donck on bail, okay? Oh dear. Stuyvesant's second-in-command undermined him? The frazzled Director General argued the prisoner was arrested for calumniating the officers of government, that his conduct tended to bring the sovereign authority into contempt. Stuyvesant turned on an instant. Van Dinklage, I've got these quotes of yours, defaming the States General. What? I never said anything remotely like that. Show me the papers. No. Brian Newton, Stuyvesant's loyal supporter since the Curaçao administration, declared that Van der Donck should stay imprisoned and be interrogated. While most of the others agreed, Augustin Heerman defiantly refused to give an opinion. And then it looked like 2 more joined Van Dinklage in his dissent. The director could no longer count on a majority vote for his plan. So, Stuyvesant didn't call for a vote and adjourned the session. 2 days later, the director assembled his personal council without the board members. By a plurality of votes, Van der Donck was kept in custody until a committee had investigated the case. The director also expelled Van der Donck from the board of 9 and held on to all his documents. Checkmate. Well, check. No one, and I mean absolutely no one in the colony was happy, and the opposition to the director and the company grew. The colony was headed for an insurrection. What else was new? But Stuyvesant planned to shut that down real quick. On March 8, 1649, Director General Stuyvesant called the people from all the villages in the area around Manhattan to gather in the church to debate a serious matter. He planned to read to them an account of Van der Donck's treasonous behavior and then announce his sentence. Just as Stuyvesant was about to speak, a vengeful Cornelis Melijn made his way through the gathered crowd toward the Lord General, waving the mandamus from the States General. Melijn announced to all in the church that he was there to give Stuyvesant the order from the government back home. He then demanded that just as Stuyvesant had pronounced his sentence publicly, he denounced the reversal of his sentence publicly. Also, he had to read the summons out loud, on the spot. Team Stuyvesant and Team Treason got into an intense argument. Eventually, the issue was put to a vote, and the councillors decided in Melijn's favor. Melijn handed the summons to Arnold van Hardenberg, a board of 9 member, and asked him to read it. Stuyvesant knew exactly what the document was about, an order for him to return to Europe like a misbehaving child. Enraged at this coup de théâtre, the Director General stood in front of Van Hardenberg. That document couldn't be read until he'd been served a copy. He yanked the paper from Van Hardenberg's hand, but the man snatched it back. The tug-of-war lasted a few minutes, then the document ripped. The States General's heavy wax seal came off and fell, dangling by a single string of parchment. Oof, holy colony metaphor, Batman. Melijn told Stuyvesant he had a copy for him, but this one was to be read to everyone. Now the disgruntled crowd chimed in, and with Stuyvesant soldiers undoubtedly waiting in the wings, things started to look ugly. Stuyvesant wanted to bring down the hammer, but as he later wrote to the States General, the chaos was so shaped that massacre and bloodshed might have been the result had we not converted ourselves from the highest to the lowest and permitted the indecent service of the summons. His enemies had checkmated Stuyvesant, and unable to make a move, he brought the assembly to order. Maarten sweetly promised to deliver him his personal copy, while von Hardenberg read the damaged paper. After he was done, all eyes turned to Stuyvesant, who, desperately trying to suppress his rage and failing, struggled to speak. "I honor the States General, and shall obey their commands. I shall send an attorney to sustain the sentence, as it was well and legally pronounced. Exit stage left." Stuyvesant later recalled the events to have been mutinous and insulting. He was devoted to turning the colony into a thriving community, but these rebels were out to destroy everything. As it turned out, the rebel community thought drama queen Maarten was a bit much. I mean, why had he bragged to the English he would send Stuyvesant back home a prisoner? How was this going to help the Director General deal with New England's governors? Still, Stuyvesant had provoked the rebellion by arresting Van der Donck, whose neck was about to taste the sting of the executioner's blade. Director General Stuyvesant's position wasn't improved when a scandal came to light involving the sale of arms to Indians. While Rensselaerswijk had been selling arms to the Native Americans for years now, Stuyvesant had put a stop to it. This made the Indians pretty mad, and everyone braced for another war. The directors of the West India Company told Stuyvesant it was the best policy to furnish them with powder and ball, but with a sparing hand. Stuyvesant promptly put in an order for a case of guns from the Republic, which was delivered at Fort Amsterdam for everyone to see. The Director General was now the only one who sold guns, powder and shot at significant profits. This got everyone up in arms, which they barely had because firearms were in short supply even among the colonists. Stuyvesant had to justify his actions to his own council. "Don't come at me, these are company orders." The council understood. The New Netherlanders did not. As this drama unfolded, Stuyvesant had to sentence the imprisoned Adriaan van der Donck. While a death sentence was in order, he knew an execution would rile up the already riled up residents even more. And then there was Lubbert van Dinklagen breathing down his neck. The lawyer incessantly checked every action against Dutch law. The evidence for Van der Donck's treason was also very thin. The Jonker claimed the papers were simply rough drafts, probably riddled with errors. So, Stuyvesant ordered Van der Donck to prove and establish or to revoke what he has injuriously written, and he released Van der Donck, for now. Van der Donck remained banned from the Board of Nine, but the residents considered the Jonker a hero, standing up against tyranny. The lawyer now set out to prove what had been written, and prepared a delegation to go to the Republic to plead for government reform. The Director General had no means to stop that, but he could close legal loopholes. He summoned all the councillors and officials to appear by the first opportunity at The Hague before their high mightinesses. He knew most of them wouldn't go to the Republic, but compiled all the answers, mostly "sorry, can't make it," into a file as evidence to show no one cared enough about reform to plead for it. On May 8th, an ever more annoyed Stuyvesant issued an ordinance. All the evidence gathered by Team Reform was null and void. Private persons weren't under oath. They weren't qualified to give advice, and most egregiously, Team Reform tricked everyone with all kinds of sinister, obscure, and dubious words. Therefore, we annul and declare invalid all affidavits, interrogatories, or other instruments serving as evidence which are written by private individuals. Stuyvesant was willing to obey the mandamus, though he disagreed with it as it undermined his position. However, shucks, he couldn't possibly leave the colony while border negotiations with New England were ongoing. He would send Cornelis van Tienhoven both to represent him against Maarten's charges and to represent his government's decisions. Van der Donck compiled all the information and wrote Vertoog van Nieuw-Nederland, Remonstrance of New Netherland, an 83-page formal complaint about the colony's tyrannical government. 3 men were deputized to explain it all to the States General in The Hague: trader Jacob Wolfertsen van Kouwenhoven, farmer Jan Evertsen Bout, and Adriaan van der Donck. Reverend Johannes Bakkerus went home with them, and Reverend Johannes Megapolensis of the Renselaerswijk colony was like, "Wait for me!" But Stuyvesant persuaded Megapolensis to stay and become the Reverend of the New Amsterdam residence. The Director General also asked for a qualified school teacher because nothing is of greater importance than the right early instruction of youth. The moment Team Reform landed in Old Amsterdam, the legal battle for control of the colony was on.